For decades, whenever people encountered someone deeply narcissistic, the same question immediately followed: what kind of parents created them? Society built an entire psychological story around this idea. Maybe the mother was emotionally cold and distant. Maybe the father treated the child like they were superior to everyone else. One theory claimed narcissism was created through emotional neglect, a child growing up unseen and unloved, eventually building grandiosity as protection against inner shame. Another theory argued the opposite, that narcissism came from excessive praise, from parents constantly telling a child they were more special, more gifted, and more important than everyone around them. Different explanations, same conclusion. The parents were responsible. Over time, this belief became deeply embedded in therapy culture, self-help books, podcasts, and social media discussions about toxic people. The message was repeated so often it began to feel unquestionable. If someone becomes narcissistic, look at the childhood, look at the family. That is where the answer must be hiding. But what if this entire explanation, the one repeated for nearly a century, is fundamentally wrong? A massive new psychological study is now forcing researchers to reconsider one of the most accepted assumptions in personality science. Because according to the data, the broad parenting environment, the emotional atmosphere of the home, and even general parenting style may contribute almost nothing to whether someone becomes narcissistic at all. And if that is true, then one of the most emotionally satisfying explanations we have ever created about human behavior may need to be completely rewritten. Before we can understand where narcissism comes from, we first need to understand what narcissism actually is. The word has become so overused that it now describes almost anyone who seems arrogant, selfish, or emotionally difficult. But in psychology, narcissism has a much more specific meaning. Researchers define it through three core traits working together. The first is grandiosity, an inflated sense of importance or superiority. The second is entitlement, the belief that one deserves special treatment, recognition, or advantages others do not. The third is status seeking, a powerful drive for admiration, prestige, and social dominance. Narcissistic people are not simply confident. They are deeply motivated by being seen, valued, and placed above others. What makes narcissism psychologically complicated is that it is not entirely destructive. In fact, some narcissistic traits can appear highly attractive at first. People high in narcissism often come across as charismatic, ambitious, socially confident, and persuasive. They tend to perform well in first impressions, leadership contests, and environments that reward visibility and confidence. They can appear unusually certain of themselves, and that certainty often draws people in. But the same traits that create early success frequently create long-term instability. The need for admiration becomes difficult relationships. The sense of superiority creates conflict. The desire for status encourages risky decisions and emotional volatility. Narcissism often produces a strange pattern where the qualities that help someone rise socially are the same qualities that eventually damage the people around them. And once these patterns form, they tend to remain remarkably stable across adulthood. Narcissism is not usually something people drift in and out of randomly. By adolescence or early adulthood, the trait becomes deeply rooted in personality. That stability is exactly why understanding its origins matters so much. Narcissistic traits shape relationships, workplaces, leadership structures, and even entire family systems. So the question of where narcissism comes from is not just academic curiosity. It affects how we understand some of the most influential and destructive personality patterns in modern life. For years, researchers faced a major problem when trying to understand where narcissism comes from. Nearly every theory blamed parenting, but there was one complication that made those conclusions far less certain than they appeared. Parents and children do not only share a household, they also share genes, and that creates what psychologists call genetic confounding. If narcissistic parents tend to have narcissistic children, how do we know whether parenting caused the trait or whether the child simply inherited biological tendencies from the parents themselves? Looking only at ordinary families cannot fully answer that question because nature and nurture become tangled together inside the same household. This is exactly why twin studies are so important in psychology. They allow researchers to separate genetic influence from environmental influence far more precisely. Identical twins share nearly all of their DNA, while fraternal twins share only about half, similar to ordinary siblings. If identical twins consistently resemble each other much more strongly than fraternal twins on a personality trait, researchers can conclude that genetics are playing a major role. But researchers can also measure environmental effects by separating life experiences into two categories. Shared environment refers to everything siblings experience together: the parenting style, the emotional atmosphere of the home, family values, financial status, and general household culture. Non-shared environment refers to individual experiences unique to one person: specific friendships, romantic relationships, workplaces, teachers, social opportunities, failures, and life events that siblings do not experience in exactly the same way. To truly test the origins of narcissism, researchers needed a much larger and more sophisticated study than anything done before. That study came from the German Twin Life Project, one of the most comprehensive behavioral genetics projects in the world. The research team analyzed data from SAR Bearchum Lum participants, including identical twins, fraternal twins, non-twin siblings, parents, and even romantic partners. This extended family structure allowed researchers to compare patterns across multiple relationships simultaneously, instead of relying on simple parent-child similarities alone. The study also controlled for something called assortative mating, the tendency for people with similar personalities to choose each other as partners. This mattered because narcissistic individuals often pair with other narcissistic individuals, which can distort genetic estimates if researchers fail to account for it properly. Participants ranged across adolescence and early adulthood, allowing researchers to examine whether the balance between biology and environment changes with age. They used carefully designed narcissism measures focused on admiration seeking, entitlement, leadership beliefs, status motivation, and interpersonal dominance. Statistical models were then applied to separate how much narcissism could be explained by genetics, how much came from shared family environment, and how much came from unique personal experiences outside the home. What made this study so powerful was not only its size, but the precision of its design. For decades, parenting theories about narcissism survived, partly because no study had been able to cleanly untangle genes from family environment. But this research finally created a framework capable of testing the question directly. And the results would challenge nearly everything psychologists thought they understood about how narcissism develops. When the researchers finally separated genetic influence from environmental influence, the results were strikingly clear. Across different age groups, measurement methods, and statistical models, the same pattern kept appearing again and again. Roughly half of the differences in narcissism between people could be explained by genetics. The other half came mostly from non-shared environmental experiences: the unique relationships, social environments, opportunities, and life events that individuals encounter throughout their lives. But the most shocking finding was what barely appeared in the data at all. The shared family environment, the parenting style, the emotional atmosphere of the home, the values siblings were raised with together contributed almost nothing to whether someone became narcissistic. For decades, psychology and popular culture treated parenting as the central engine behind narcissism. Cold parents supposedly created narcissistic wounds. Overvaluing parents supposedly created narcissistic entitlement. Yet this study found almost no evidence that these broad parenting patterns environmentally transmitted narcissism in any significant way. The resemblance between narcissistic parents and narcissistic children was real, but it was explained primarily through shared genetics rather than shared parenting behavior. And in some analyses, researchers even found something deeply counterintuitive. After accounting for genetics, the remaining environmental influence from narcissistic parents appeared slightly negative rather than positive. The researchers themselves were cautious about interpreting this result, but it clearly did not support the traditional idea that narcissistic parenting directly produces narcissistic children through environmental conditioning alone. Another important finding involved assortative mating. Narcissistic individuals were significantly more likely to pair with other narcissistic individuals. This means that narcissism may appear to run in families, partly because people with similar personality traits choose each other as partners, increasing the likelihood that children inherit genetic predispositions from both sides. In other words, the family resemblance exists, but not for the reasons most people assumed. The implications of these findings are difficult to overstate. Entire cultural narratives about narcissism were built around the idea that parenting style was the primary cause. Therapy culture, social media discussions, and even major psychological theories all repeated versions of the same story. Look at the parents, and you will find the explanation. But this research suggests the reality is far more complicated. Human personality may be shaped less by broad household environment than by inherited biology combined with thousands of unique individual experiences unfolding across a lifetime. And for many people, that realization creates an uncomfortable but necessary shift in perspective. Because it forces us to let go of emotionally satisfying explanations and confront a more complex truth about how personality actually develops. What this research ultimately suggests is not that parenting is meaningless, but that human personality is far more complicated than the simple formula of childhood equals destiny. Parenting still matters deeply for emotional safety, attachment, communication, and psychological development. Loving parents matter, stable homes matter, emotional warmth matters. But when it comes specifically to narcissism, the broad family environment does not appear to be the main force shaping the trait. Instead, narcissism seems to emerge through a far more complex interaction between inherited biology and individual life experiences unfolding over time. Genetics provide part of the foundation, influencing tendencies towards status-seeking, dominance, confidence, and sensitivity to admiration. But the rest develops through environments outside the family itself. Peer groups, romantic relationships, workplaces, social rewards, career structures, and cultural environments all become part of the process. A person who repeatedly discovers that charisma, self-promotion, or superiority bring attention and success may strengthen those traits over time. Another person with similar genetic tendencies but different experiences may develop very differently. This is why the study points researchers toward biography as much as biology. Human beings are shaped not only by where they begin, but by the specific paths they travel afterward. And perhaps the most uncomfortable part of this research is what it asks us to let go of emotionally. For decades, many people found comfort in the belief that difficult personalities could always be traced back to one clear cause inside childhood. It gave us a simple explanation: a villain, a wound, a place to point. But science does not always preserve the explanations that feel emotionally satisfying. Sometimes it replaces them with explanations that are more complex, less emotionally clean, and far more honest. The reality emerging from this research is that narcissistic people are not simply created by cold parents or indulgent homes. They are shaped by inherited tendencies interacting with countless experiences across an entire life. Biology and biography become intertwined in ways no single theory can fully simplify. And maybe there is something strangely humanizing about that realization. It reminds us that personality is not built from one moment, one parent, or one childhood experience alone. Human beings are more complicated than that. The people around us, including the most difficult ones, are the result of forces far wider, stranger, and more layered than the stories we usually tell ourselves.